Wow, I'm really impressed to see how many folks have come back for a second evening of this, and I really appreciate your participation. I have two disclaimers on this PowerPoint. The first is that I picked a lovely seasonal pumpkin color for the headers, which looks a little more brown and a little less pumpkinish than I had anticipated. And the second is that I typically do PowerPoints that are almost all photographs. But this is a very wordsmithing-minded group. So most of my images on this are going to have lots of words and very few images. So just to help everybody remember, the scope of what I'm looking at for the city is how the concerns and opinions and ideas expressed at the last public meeting impact the section of the design guidelines draft that we prepared in 2011 for additions and new construction. So I'm going to focus on that as I take us through this. And one of the things I checked into since our last meeting was how many COA applications are received by the Historic Development Commission for infill, for additions. And since the last bylaws changed in 2009, you can see that 1.4% of the applications have had to do with new construction infill. 2% have had to do with large additions defined as 25% or more square footage added to the property. And 5.4% have been for small additions, less than 25%. So I think that helps to keep it in perspective that this is less than 10% of all the COA applications that come through. Obviously, 91% have to do with existing buildings, existing site issues. Well, I heard a lot last time, and I read a lot, and I've sliced and diced all those scanned flip chart pages and little index cards, and really try to look for the patterns and the themes that emerge from the comments, written and verbal, and emails, et cetera, that were all submitted. And certainly what I found was a very wide range of concerns and opinions expressed. There were a lot of self-identified middle grounders who came to the meeting, and others who took a very strong stance on, at either end of the pendulum, on specific issues that we were discussing. I also heard comments that range from the guidelines are totally dysfunctional to they need fine-tuning to find the guidelines to be quite good. Certainly, many of you commented on the need for more clarity and better communication. Lots of folks talked about a balance between restrictions and incentives. And there also were a lot of suggestions that fall beyond the scope of what I'm working on right now for the city, but many of them are helpful suggestions and ones that I certainly hope don't fall off of the radar screen. But comments that had to do with garages, for example, there is a section on garages and secondary buildings, and it addresses new construction of those. It's just not in this section. There are guidelines about repair and maintenance, about landscaping, and many other issues that were brought up and are very valid concerns, but not part of the section that I was working on. I also heard that many of you are looking for predictability and consistency, the ability to respond to density and growth intelligently, others who appreciate ambiguity and the open to interpretation aspect of the guidelines. Many stress the point of valuing citizen input. Comments like change is inevitable, we need to manage it. Compromise preserves harmony, and my personal favorite, no Mr. Potato Head house of poorly designed compilations. Somehow that just visually spoke to me. And certainly comments about separate guidelines for commercial and residential issues in the districts. And that is a part of how the guidelines are organized now. In the new construction section, we talk about urban infill versus primary buildings. And we also have a section on storefronts in existing building section. So there is some parsing of it in that way, but we don't use that exact correlation all the way through. One of the overwhelming messages that I heard and read is the broad support for preserving and protecting the historic character and livability of the historic districts. Many of you, as you talked about values, talked about good stewardship, good design, respect of context, a living community to protect that balance, economic stability, protection of property values, and preserving the neighborhood experience. I would say that was a message that came through loud and clear from all of the groups at our last meeting. And I also heard a lot of comments and read a lot of comments about the special character essays that are a part of the guidelines. They are included in the appendix and are referred to throughout the guidelines as part of the way decisions need to be made by the commission. I heard concerns that the special essays aren't used in making decisions, concern that the essays need updating, concern that the district periods of significance may need to be expanded, and even a few who question whether the districts themselves might need some expansion. Just as a reminder, what the guidelines say from the get-go on page V of the forward is the special character essays for each district are a critical part of the review process. And they're cited numerous times in the new construction and addition section as part of how decisions would be made. So I want to assure you that that's always been the intent, is that those descriptions of the special character of the districts are applied depending on where the property is. Two things that I would recommend based on the comments is it probably is time to update the special character essays and probably do that on a regular cycle, have some sort of time frame of when they get updated. And also that as a part of that, it is probably time to look at whether the period of significance for the districts needs to be expanded as well. Many districts have been looking at those issues across our state and beyond. A huge concern that came through loud and clear was the concern about tear downs and overbuilding in our historic districts. I definitely heard a shared concern about the impact they're having on the districts and the fact that the RHDC only has the power to delay demolition for 365 days. A lot of folks voiced a desire to de-incentivize tear downs. A lot of folks, or certainly others, commented on, can we limit new construction where there's been a tear down to the original footprint of the building? Can we limit it to a certain percentage of increase of that footprint? Ways to prevent overbuilding in the districts. This is, of course, a big issue. We got a little bit of a break from it thanks to our recent recession, but it's coming back loud and strong. And it obviously is a concern among many of you who were here a month ago. The RHDC does not have the power to dictate that the footprint of new infill where there's been a tear down cannot be any larger than the existing, than the footprint of the original building. However, there are a lot of strategies and possibilities how the community might look at other ways to de-incentivize tear downs through ordinances. For example, several years ago, Raleigh was on the forefront of demolition by neglect. There are also ways you could look at incentives, carrots that might help with this. this issue. What the RHDC can look at is if they've delayed demolition, they can look at ways to try and help explore alternatives to demolition. That's certainly part of their charge. And they can also look at reviewing very carefully proposed new construction on tear-down sites. In response to the concern for this, I did add new text and images in the new construction section of the guidelines, and there are copies of the draft with the new text and guidelines added that are going to be distributed at the end of the meeting. I also wanted to mention that the National Trust for Historic Preservation has a number of articles about tear-downs and a tear-down toolkit that has a lot of good examples of what other communities have done to be proactive about this issue of tear-downs. So if this is an issue that is dear to your heart, I would recommend taking a look at that website. So one of the things that was already in the guidelines was under additions 4 to 11, it is not appropriate to construct an addition that significantly changes the proportion of original built mass to open space on the individual site. We had that in there, and some of you were suggesting that we might want to quantify that further. A couple of folks suggested perhaps saying it can't increase it by 50% over what it is now. I heard that suggestion from a couple of folks. My professional opinion is the minute you put a percentage on it, you have no negotiation room for less than that folks will always go to that larger number. That's my professional opinion, so I chose not to insert a percentage figure in that, but rather to leave it to interpretation of when does it become significant in impacting it. The two new guidelines that I added here were both under additions and also under infill, new construction. And that, you can read them here, very parallel language. Not appropriate to construct an addition if the overall proportion of open space on the site will significantly vary from the surrounding buildings and sites that contribute to the special character of the historic district. And likewise with the new construction. Again, trying to address that concern that if there's been a tear down and new construction is proposed, that you're looking at what's typical of the ratio of built to unbuilt on those sites. And again, tying it to buildings and sites that contribute to the special character of the district. There had been some concern about what buildings are we comparing these to, or what sites are we comparing it to. Another thing I heard was concern about what does compatible or compatibility mean, wanting clarity on that terminology, defining compatibility, defining compatible in terms of historic development, materials, fenestrations, additions, and new construction, substitution of congruous for compatible, coming from our state enabling legislation, and replacing wherever compatible was used with compatible and consistent. I would recommend defining compatible in the way I've defined it. There are a lot of definitions out there, many very, very similar. I went for capable of existing together in harmony, consistent or congruous, usually followed by with in a phrase. And I chose together in harmony over together without conflict because I thought it spoke more positively to what we're all seeking with this. I feel like this certainly should be added to the glossary. There is no question is a term that requires interpretation. And I also want to point out that in the text of the existing guidelines for new construction and additions, there are lots of explanations of what criteria are you evaluating compatibility. For example, roof form or height or window shape, those kinds of things. So I don't feel like repeating that in the glossary is as important as seeing it right there in the design guidelines. Okay, so the biggest issue that I found the widest difference of opinion on was the use of the term architectural style. people were all over the map on this. Definitely the biggest pendulum swing on this. Folks feeling strongly architectural style shouldn't be used in the new construction guidelines. Others thinking it should be. I have a lot of quotes here just to show you some of the range of the opinions that I read and heard on this topic. I particularly want to point out guidelines allow for interpretation, traditional or less traditional. Do we have to pick one or the other? It's hard to find a good definition of architectural style. It's a term that's become a bit outdated in terms of best practices now in preservation and planning because we see lots of hybrid construction today and less sort of transition from one style to the next to the next. But I thought this was a fair definition coming from Wikipedia of what we mean when we talk about architectural style, and it certainly could be added to the glossary. As I did more research about this, many have pointed out that our statewide enabling legislation for historic districts specifically mentions architectural style in its listing of exterior features. And that was generated in 1989. Started out with a couple of our early, with Winston-Salem and Wilmington, looking at historic districts there. And but it is still in there. It is still part of the enabling legislation. Then I looked at the Handbook for Historic Preservation Commissions in North Carolina that was published back in 1994 as a joint publication from Preservation North Carolina and our State Historic Preservation Office. And here they cite the state enabling legislation and list criteria that should be looked at in reviewing for certificates of appropriateness. And they too list architectural style as one of the criteria that the enabling legislation mentions. But they also state that guidelines should not require particular architectural features or styles. So then I went and looked at the National Park Service brief number 14, which was updated in 2010. And it is the brief about new exterior additions to historic buildings, preservation concerns. And if you haven't looked at that brief, I would encourage you to look at it if this is an issue that concerns you. I think they do a really good job of explaining the philosophy behind the thinking about new additions and give multiple examples of additions, of various types of additions, and discuss what makes them compatible and appropriate. I found this quote particularly helpful. A new addition to a historic building that meets the standards can be any architectural style, traditional, contemporary, or a simplified version of the historic building. However, there must be a balance between differentiation and compatibility in order to maintain the historic character of the building being enlarged. New additions that too closely resemble the historic building or are in extreme contrast to it fall short of the balance. To me, this really gets at the issues that we want to be looking at new additions in terms of their differentiation and yet their compatibility. And I think very parallel language can be used to describe the issues for infill in terms of the streetscape and the surrounding historic district. So what do I recommend in terms of this architectural style issue? First, I think we acknowledge that inclusion of architectural style is referenced in the enabling legislation. Who knows if that may be revisited at some point or updated. At this point, it's still in there. Acknowledge that there is great diversity of community opinion on the application of architectural style to new construction and additions. Definitely, as I've said, the issue that showed the broadest range of opinions on it. So my recommendation is to include architectural style in the guidelines and define it in the glossary. I recommend taking a both-and approach parallel to what the Park Service brief talks about and clarify that the style of new construction and additions can range from traditional to contemporary. And whatever the architectural style, differentiation and compatibility of new construction are key. I think this is what the guidelines draft was already saying, but we had not addressed or explicitly use the term architectural style. I added, in addition to text that I added and guidelines I added in response to these questions and suggestions, I wanted to include here some photographs that I've added to the guidelines because I think that they help clarify some of the issues of compatibility and contemporary versus traditional. This is a deck, an exterior rear deck, and I used it as an example where in the guidelines it recommends, because decks are contemporary features, that they not try to directly mimic the style of the existing building. And here, this is a traditional wood constructed deck. However, the metal tubing that is a part of the railings clearly is a contemporary touch here. And to me, it's a very compatible deck that speaks to its own period, but is also fits in quite well with the rear yard of this historic house. In terms of additions, here's added another image of rear additions. There's a lot of concern about how much of the backyard might be taken over by an addition. Here, I thought it was particularly apparent that this addition was designed so that those two mature trees could be retained on the site. And also, this addition clearly is broken down in terms of its massing and differentiations in the roof shape, so that it doesn't compete but rather differs with the existing bungalow that it's been added onto. I also looked at the rather large addition to First Presbyterian Church. I think this one could be looked at as new infill in an urban context as opposed to an addition. But either way, I think it's a really good example of how it is compatible with the existing church, yet not overpowering to it, and also is starting to mediate to the commercial buildings that join it on the other side. To me, it's a great example of contemporary detailing with traditional materials and with a clear respect for the build-to sight line and the pedestrian scale of the street. And I also looked at this building in the historic districts as a new construction project. I chose it particularly because there seemed to be some opinions that only one architectural style should be used in new construction, sort of the opposite of the Mr. Potato Head approach. And I thought this is a good one to make the point that much of our architecture, historic or new, is not a single architectural style. This building combines craftsman style with Victorian style, but yet it has an inset porch that is only a partial front porch. So it's combining elements and features from several different styles, and yet it's all pulling together. And my perception is folks in Raleigh perceive it as a successful, traditionally influenced infill corner building in a historic district. So to me, that's part of sort of revisiting this idea of architectural style, is how rare it is to find a building that is truly just of one style, and how many of our historic buildings are already combinations of multiple styles in them. The challenge, of course, is not to see the Mr. Potato Head combination, but to see a way that we are pulling them together in a way that they work together and become a compatible new solution there. So this process has shown me that we are not like Ed Stein's madmen in conflict for the insignificant thing. Don't you just love that cartoon? Rather, I feel that your participation in the public comment process earlier and tonight has revealed deep respect and commitment to preserving and enhancing Raleigh's historic districts and landmarks. While there are clear differences of opinion on some issues, I hope the both and approach and middle of the road approach in terms of how far does our pendulum swing, in Pratt Cassidy's words, will allow us to move forward together. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
couple of questions. You talked about the diversity of opinion, but you did not speak to whether there was a majority view or a dominant view of one way or the other, because I read through all the table comments and the formal comments, and I certainly agree there's a diversity and a far swing, but I also saw a lot of stronger themes that I didn't hear you address. Can you comment on some of those issues in terms of where there was a dominant view, if you will?
Dominant view. I would say that as I sorted and looked for patterns, I was aware of how often an idea came up. I was also aware that sometimes there were memos or emails signed by 5 people or 80 people. And I did not try to do a quantitative tit for tat on that. When I looked at the table summaries, I really tried to get what was the key message from that table. And when I looked at the emails, I found, I would say there were more middle of the roaders on many of these topics than there were the extreme views. However, I'm not discounting the extreme views. I'm just looking at how can we move forward, because I think it's got to be a both and approach to many of these issues.
Can you explain the current circumstances under which a building in a historic district could be torn down?
In a historic district, a property owner who wants to demolish a building must apply for a certificate of appropriateness to demolish that building. And it goes before the RHDC, and they can choose to approve that request, or they can choose to delay it for up to 365 days. That comes from statewide legislation that gives them that power to do that. The intent of delaying it is to look for solutions that would allow the building to stay or possibly be relocated. But the commission does not have the power to deny demolition.
Just want to echo that one question after you had said that you strove for balance. I heard, so the question why, and I didn't know whether you were able to elaborate, why is balance the value that you in particular would bring to the design guidelines?
Well, I see this as a community that we need to build consensus in. And there were clearly some opinions where it's a win or lose if we go to either extreme. And so I looked at ways to try to address the concern or to clarify what that issue might mean in the Raleigh districts or landmarks as a way for us to reach a different understanding about it.
Thank you. Okay. So she didn't want to speak in the microphone, but her question was whether this discussion pertains to Raleigh overall or just a particular subset of the districts. Did I ask the question right? Yeah.
This discussion is specifically for Raleigh's locally zoned historic districts and locally designated landmarks.
Does this mean that anywhere where there are buildings that are deemed historic, those will be maintained?
This does not guarantee maintenance of buildings. If a building is in a historic district and the property owner wants to make changes to it that require a certificate of appropriateness, then they submit an application to the RHDC, which is reviewed, and a certificate of appropriateness is granted if the RHDC perceives that the proposed change is appropriate in the historic district.
Yeah, just real quick, on the tear down that you just mentioned, the 365-day delay, that's only for contributing structures, right? If you have a home in a historic district, but it is not within the period of significance,
No.
can't they, there's a
That's not my understanding. My understanding is that if you're in the district, in the locally zoned district, you are, you do have to request a certificate of appropriateness.
Right.
The commission might decide that that building does not contribute to the special character of the district, so they might not require a 365-day delay.
Okay, thank you.
This is a question that might draw upon your familiarity with other districts within the state. some who have criticized the current guidelines of the Raleigh RHDC have suggested that, in particular in Charlotte, the local historic district, and I don't know the name of it, has suffered at the hands of tear downs and, quote, inappropriate rebuilds in that district. Can you share with us any knowledge that you have of Charlotte in this case?
I am not familiar with the specifics of, I know they have a very urban historic district, and I would imagine there's huge development pressures, and that's part of what a locally zoned historic district can do, is to help mitigate or prevent the sorts of overbuilding and tear downs that you might see elsewhere. But I am not, I didn't do design guidelines for Charlotte, and I haven't, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that district.
Yes, you mentioned that the RHDC would not be able to limit building to the original footprint, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. Why don't they have the authority, or if it's not in the guidelines, could we put it in the guidelines?
I'm going to let Martha Lauer answer that.
Staff contacted the city attorney's office, and the city attorney was very firm that this was not a guideline that would be appropriate in Raleigh. One of the purposes of historic districts and the design guidelines is to follow the special character of the district and of surrounding structures in a more local way, and that by putting some sort of limit on what you can build or can't build can actually have unintended consequences of having something built back that may not be consistent or compatible or congruous with a historic district. And so that is the reason. One of the challenging things I think about historic districts and historic district commissions is that it is made up of members of the community as the people who issue COAs. And so there's always a little bit of uncertainty about are they traditional, are they less traditional, and that type of thing. But the guidelines should support appropriate contextual infill.
About 15 more minutes. Raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
I would just add to Martha's explanation that although I couldn't say it should follow the footprint of the original building, I certainly added new language, and what you'll see in the handouts are that new insertions of text are underlined, just to make it clear what's been added. I will confess that on the page on new construction of primary buildings, it was so tight that I had to edit a bit some of the existing text, not to change the content, but just to get a little more space on that page to fit in some of the new language that I added.
Could you speak briefly to what other communities have successfully done to limit tear downs in their historic districts? What's been the most effective way to limit them?
I would recommend looking at the tear down guides and toolkit on the National Trust website as a good summary of the variety of tools. Some have been sort of proactive sort of advocacy, some have been ordinances, and some have been financial incentives of some sort that help counter the drive for larger development. But I can't pretend to be an expert on all the initiatives that are taking place with tear downs.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to limiting new construction to a particular size or percentage. Part 5.4 of the city's Uniform Development Ordinance describes neighborhood conservation districts, and it does have some language about replacement buildings reflecting in terms of mass, proportion, scale, orientation to the street, etc. And I believe that section goes on to describe a percentage of replacement building size.
I believe it does. I believe it says 150%.
Okay.
That is a city ordinance.
Right.
These are design guidelines that need to follow what powers the RHDC has. And again, it's my understanding that, let me back up. It could be the decision of the RHDC and the community to specify a % of change. I explained my opinion that the minute you say it can get this much bigger, that becomes the go-to number. So I tried to talk about how important it was to respect the setback, to respect the amount of built space to open space, and to talk about not changing that significantly without putting a percentage on it. It does mean that there's interpretation and flexibility there. But these are my recommendations, and it could be that a decision is made to go with specific numbers.
Could you elaborate on the your comment about altering the period of significance? Because to me, the period of significance really is what defines the integrity of the historic neighborhood to begin with. So altering the period of significance, to me, really has a profound effect on, is this really a historic neighborhood anymore? And are you changing the definition of what this neighborhood really should be?
Okay. What I talked about is that the RHDC may want to consider expanding the period of significance, because that came up from another number of people. And I have seen that as a trend in many historic districts where the story they're telling has continued to unfold. And they cut it off when the nomination was originally written because there wasn't a 50-year gap, and that's sort of the benchmark for most districts. So I wasn't saying it should be expanded. I said I was recommending that it be considered as part of updating the special character essays and considering what story these districts continue to tell.
When you say that buildings should, well, you're referencing significantly varies from surrounding buildings that contribute to the special character of the historic district. Does that include only buildings within the period of significance, or does the contribution to the special character extend beyond those buildings?
Your essays on the special character of the district talk about the district as a whole. They certainly talk about the styles, the architecture, the character of the streetscapes, all of those things. So to me, it is not limiting it to a building that is from the period of significance, but it's certainly saying that the buildings you're looking to understand what the character is are contributing to the district's character and not in conflict with it.
And this is not a question, but a clarification, actually two clarifications. On the neighborhood conservation district issue, the historic overlay districts are a subjective, quasi-judicial design review based on guidelines that are interpreted by the commission. There's only one place in the state statutes that allows that to happen, and it is in historic overlay districts. And all the rest of the world of zoning, it has to be definable, measurable things that staff can interpret in order to be able to enforce the zoning code. So the neighborhood conservation districts are an overlay that is managed through the staff review process of the issuance of permits. So you have to have specific numbers that staff can say, does it meets it or it doesn't meet it, permit or no permit. So that's the difference between the historic overlay districts and the neighborhood conservation tool that was built into the code to help those areas that people felt strongly about what was happening with the tear down phenomenon and what the nature of infill was in neighborhoods that were not considered historic, but still they felt strongly about or had some character. So that's the difference on those. And just the period of significance issue, recognizing that time does march on, Oakwood was designated in 1972, I think, when the National Register nomination was made. The local district, which used the National Register nomination, was 1975. So that's, my math is not so good, but 25, 35, 40 years have passed in the evolution of Oakwood. And so that time frame in 1976 that they talked about going through the beginning of the Depression, 1929, has just moved. So it's good preservation planning practice to go back and look at your districts to see if the passage of time has made a difference in its character, but it doesn't necessarily mandate it. And the other aspect of that just left my brain, so I'll stop talking.
I would also say that our periods of significance that the Commission uses are done through a research process that is in partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office. So there is always that National Register nomination basis for deciding what that period of significance is. The challenge with Oakwood is that the nomination is very, very old. And I know that there is a citizen who's working on updating all the buildings within the National Register nomination and maybe taking that to the State Historic Preservation Office. And actually those researchers and historians will have a lot to say about what the period of significance is. It's a very professional historical perspective that's provided by the state.
Where's the next question? Where's the hand? Oh, okay. Just that the Commission's work program has focused on new National Register districts in order to give more people access to the tax credits, and that is why they have not been updating the old ones, because they were already done, but they can change their priorities anytime.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a little bit about, and you may not know about this, the delisting of sections and entire historic districts, because there have been quite a few. And I've talked to the National Park Service about this. I don't know if Claudia Brown is here. She may be able to tell you more because she's been working on the one for Dilworth and Charlotte that was mentioned earlier. But there are losses going on because of too many tear downs, too much infill, and too many inappropriate additions, and that is a fact. I don't know what other people think about historic districts. We're a very small percentage of the land area in Raleigh. We're adding new districts all the time. Those new districts can encompass newer styles, newer types of buildings, more commercial, schools, etc. I cannot understand the reasoning behind wanting to change one that already exists that's extremely significant in order to make it just like any other neighborhood. So my question is, if you're going to we've already got a pretty long period of significance in Oakwood, but if you make just keep expanding your limitations on period of significance, just keep making all kinds of changes, what differentiates that from any other neighborhood in the downtowns and in the older parts of town? Why do we even have a historic district? What's the purpose of it? If we want to just save particular buildings, we could designate those individually. There's no purpose to having a district that I can understand. This is how it was presented to us when we all bought our properties there. Many people have multiple properties there, and we are feeling pretty stabbed in the back here. So I haven't heard you say anything that would justify that so far. So I must really not understand what a historic district is about, or it's suddenly changed for some reason. Because for 40 years it was done a certain way, and in the past 3 years, now all of a sudden everything's very, very different because that's what the fad is to do in some historic districts, but I guarantee you it's not being done everywhere. And in fact, it's not being done in most places. And if you look on the National Park Service and look at revising PB 14, you'll see that they feel they were in error in encouraging so much differentiation. And I spoke with Ann Grimmer about this. I think it's up to every city and every district, but I need an explanation because right now I haven't heard it.
Well, the issue of whether the period of significance should be expanded would come out of the study of the special character of the district and updating the National Register nomination. And I have, in my recommendation, said I think that the special character, the district essays should be updated. And Dan has mentioned that because of working on new districts, they haven't been updated in a while.
What makes it special? If you can change the period of a historic significance, doesn't that undermine the historic significance of any particular neighborhood?
Changing it would always be would be moving the cutoff of the period of significance to follow whatever gives that district its special character. So it's not a carte blanche that everything's going to get updated, but I have seen the trend in North Carolina that many local districts have updated it because more happened after the cutoff of the original nomination preparation. I sit on the National Register Advisory Committee for the state, and I've seen a number of district expansions and nominations, but I didn't come with a list today, but I'm sure Ann Swallow in that office could tell you what districts have extended their period of significance.
Thanks, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
When the city of Raleigh does their reviews for the certificate of appropriateness, do they take a holistic approach to whether something largely meets the criteria, and if there are some things that don't meet it, then they look at, okay, does it still contribute? Or is it sort of like check all the boxes, and if something's amiss, then we can't accept this?
My understanding would be that because these are guidelines and not standards or the check off what percent or quantitative like some ordinance would have, that these guidelines are to give guidance and to offer, help the commissioners interpret the decisions. And that's why you often see a phrase like generally in there, because again, it's not a check off the box, but is reading the guidelines. They typically start with the big picture guidelines and then get down to some very specific ones that have come up again and again, and the commission wants to be clear about something that's not appropriate. So to answer your question, I feel that the commission is looking at the big picture and also looking for how this project is consistent with the guidelines versus whether there's clear conflicts.
Your task for this next 45 minutes is to talk together about which of Joe's recommendations are most important to you personally, which of Joe's recommendations are most important to you and why, and then shifting to a more fuller table perspective, what concerns would your table want the commission to consider as it reviews the recommendations? What concerns would your table want the commission to consider? And then boil it down, if you would, to 3 points from the discussion that you want to communicate to the commission.
I find it so exciting to see so many people passionate about preservation in this room. We're all really busy, especially this time of year, and I just want to say thank you for coming to share your wisdom and your guidance with the Commission. The second question that City Council asked us to answer is, should the committee structure of the Raleigh Historic Development Commission be revisited? What we heard at the last meeting is that there are some people who would like to see the committee composition maintained, and that there are some people who would like to see an increased number of COA committee members as part of the commission. I wanted to talk a little bit about how our commission is broken down. We have 12 members at any given time, and it's broken down mainly into 3 committees. You have your Certificate of Appropriateness Committee, which has 5 members and 2 alternates. The quorum for one of those meetings is 3 members. You have a Community Awareness Committee, which has 4 members, and you have the Research Committee, which is 3 members. So that adds up to be 12. And typically your 2 alternates, of course, are going to be people who are doing double time on the COA committee and on one of the other 2 committees. We have a couple of other committees, the Executive Committee, which is officers and committee chairs. And so you can imagine each commissioner is attending about 3 meetings a month. Nominations, we have 3 members, but that is only done right about the time when we are making recommendations to City Council about new commissioners. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But, you know, so the city's work, or the commission's work, is broken down into 3 main categories. And I wanted to point out, you know, that the Community Awareness Committee is who puts on events like this, plans the food, hires the speakers, finds the event spaces, produces a newsletter, does the website and the mobile app. And that's, you know, mainly what the Community Awareness Committee does. And the Research Committee looks at identifying new landmarks. They review all types of National Register nominations and landmark reports, other documents. They also sometimes review documents that are prepared by the city, where the city might have a plan for an area that includes historic resources. Staff's recommendation to the commission is to support the current committee structure. There's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes. It's a very working commission. However, we did see that several people felt like the Certificate of Appropriateness Committee sometimes only had 3 people, and that a 2-1 vote was troubling to them. So what we're recommending is that the commission consider revising our bylaws to require a 3 affirmative vote for any quasi-judicial decision. So that would mean that it would need 3 affirmative votes anytime something was approved at a COA committee meeting. Other issues were identified in this process, and although they were not included in City Council's request, we felt like we really wanted to talk about them, bring up topics, and get some feedback. The commission composition has been a big topic. Some people want fewer architects. Some people think that we should require experience in design and specific expertise in other fields that are related to preservation. Some people wanted to see an increase in the number of commissioners, felt that the neighborhood input of candidates should be considered, that multiple district and landmark representation should be ensured throughout the process of nominations, and that there should be transparency in commissioner selection process. In terms of professional diversity, we are a little bit limited in how we can address that as things stand today. Raleigh Unified Development Ordinance states that a majority of the members shall have demonstrated special interest, experience, or education in history, architecture, archaeology, or related fields. What this means is that people with some sort of experience or education in preservation or archaeology or other related fields are greatly appreciated, but also that a person who has demonstrated interest, like purchased a historic home and rehabilitated it themselves, would qualify as well. But the important thing is that this is derived directly from the state statute, which states basically the same thing. And so, we are bound by state statute. That is what tells cities what they can do. And so at this point, that is something that is a little beyond our control. In addition, certified local government participation requires that we appoint people with these same characteristics. So the Certified Local Government Program is a national program through the National Park Service that allows us to be beneficiaries of the Historic Preservation Fund grants that come out annually, and we have benefited greatly in Raleigh by being able to do additional National Register nominations, doing design guideline projects, and other preservation planning type projects. And so they actually say that we have to provide resumes showing that our members meet these qualifications. How to guarantee diversity. This is a really hard thing because this is a volunteer commission. And so City Council typically appoints people who have expressed interest, either to the commission or to them personally. It's a working commission, and when people have served like 6 years, they wave at us and they tell us that they love us, and then they run really, really far. They're tired, or they may have other, civic projects they want to do, and this is a really time-consuming commission. They work really hard. So it's 2-year terms with a maximum of 3 consecutive terms. The commission has a role in its bylaws and procedures where we make recommendations to City Council about people that the commission has invited. Actually, the nominations committee has solicited their resumes, and they'll make some sort of recommendation there. But usually, we're not like pushing people off. In terms of numbers, I will just say that over the years, the commission number went all the way up to 32, and that can be a very big management challenge to support that many commissioners in the field. And that is how they settled on the number of 12 and the committee, who is 5 plus 2 alternates. Our recommendation to the commission is to support the current UDO requirements for membership. But because people feel like it's not a transparent process, we're recommending that the commission send out postcards that will go out annually that will say, hey, it's that time of year again. If you're interested in serving on the commission, please submit your resumes. Again, you can submit them to the commission themselves with a letter of interest, or you can approach your city councilor. Our recommendation to the community is that you forward resumes of people that you care for directly to the council if you have really strong feelings. And that you ask your friends, aren't you willing to serve? There were a lot of comments about the commission needing more support. One was that the commission needed more financial support. One is that we should have legal counsel at COA committee meetings during quasi-judicial public hearings. And one is that we need additional staff. Our recommendation is that the commission thoughtfully consider the annual budget request to the city that they make every year. And we will forward your comments about staffing and the legal counsel to the appropriate city staff. Commission training, there was a lot of concern that the commission was either really well trained, and then some people thought that we really need to ensure that their training was adequate. We do have certified local government requirements where we have to provide a certain amount of training every year that is submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. And we actually, as Raleigh, have been very fortunate to do a lot of training opportunities because the city has allowed a budget for it. But we do have annual COA training that is done by staff. We've had speakers in. We attend conferences and other things. So our recommendation is that the commission continue to support training of staff and commissioners. Finally, a few COA committee improvements, meeting improvements. One was that the commissioners need microphones One is that we publish staff comments prior to the meeting, and one is that we have a brief presentation by staff of each case. The audio-visual question, we actually, we are in room 305. We have always held our meetings there because it's slightly less formal. You know, some people who are coming to get a COA are just a person who has a house who wants to paint something interesting on it. And having an informal setting like 305 has seemed to be a good way to go. But to improve audiovisual, we do have the opportunity to move to council chambers, which would be much more formal. The presentation of case, it might increase the length of meetings, but it might also focus the discussion. And finally, publication of staff comments. There have been a few people who've expressed the idea that it would be nice to be able to see staff comments in advance, and I might let Tanya speak to that in a moment. Tonight, we'd like some feedback from you on whether or not you're willing to give up the informality of room 305 to move to the city council chambers in order to hear better, or if you'd rather stay in room 305 and try to use the city's system for requesting assistance in hearing. If we move to city council chambers, it will be televised and potentially run on RTN. Is that something that you guys are excited about? And if we were to think about publishing staff comments early, it would be a situation where we would have to actually increase the number of days between when you apply and when you receive a COA. That would be an issue. And there are also, I think, some legal considerations, but we'd like to hear if you're really interested in that. So staff's recommendations are for the commission to basically evaluate the comments that you have on those topics. And finally, you asked for community training. And so we're also asking for feedback from participants. You know, if we were to reinvigorate our community conversation series, what would you like to learn about? You know, who are the speakers you'd like for us to bring in? Is it about process? Is it about architecture? You know, just give us some ideas of what you think would be interesting to you. And would you prefer an evening presentation in you know, some sort of auditorium, or would you prefer some sort of workshop that was half day? So we recommend that you that the commission consider reinvigorating the community conversation series based on feedback.
Okay, and we're actually going to just go ahead and continue, and I'm going to go ahead and do the brief overview for question number 3 as well, and then you'll have the opportunity to talk about both of those at the same time. And, you know, what we heard is, you know, some concerns about, you know, building permit issuance, and that we should look at the city regulations that, you know, allowed a building to be constructed during an appeal period. And this is, I mean, it's already been forwarded to the appropriate staff, but we'll forward it again, that this is something that's still out there in the community for discussion. And question 3, which was, you know, how can you know, property owners and, you know, residents be made aware that they live in a historic district, and what does it mean? You know, a lot of people may know they're in a historic district if they're buying in a historic district, but that doesn't mean they know what it means. And we heard a lot of suggestions, primarily dealing with outreach, you know, lots of, you know, periodic trainings, improving the website, having community liaisons, you know, historic overlay district mailings, and you know, a bunch of different ideas. And so out of all of those, what staff is recommending is that we update a current brochure, which you haven't seen for some time because things changed. The name of the district changed. We've moved. I mean, lots of reasons. So update that brochure. And so with the FAQs about what it means, it would also, of course, be made available on the website, and we'd have it for anyone that wants it. Look at exploring technological methods for new residence owner mailings, and that is tying in primarily with the new land management system that the city is in the process of implementing. It will likely be a couple of years before that's in place, but I am hopeful that we will have a a way to be made aware of when there are either new purchases or new, water taps. There's some way of being notified when we need to contact people. And consider periodic commissioner attendance at your local neighborhood meetings so that there's an opportunity for questions and just sort of getting our faces out there. And with that, there being some sort of outreach to realtors, whether it's providing training, an annual letter, encouraging them to link to the RHDC website, and encouraging realtors to try to understand what it means to be an HOD in a local district, and sharing that information when they're either selling or purchasing a property. And so staff's recommendation is that the commission explore the opportunity to develop a continuing education course for realtors in historic preservation. And that is something that we are actively pursuing, as it is. And so the commission will look into that. And then there were a couple of additional items that were noted that we think are important, but they are, outside of the control of the Historic Development Commission and the city. And that is, somehow recording historic overlay district zoning on the deed, or including the HOD zoning information in the Wake County database. I'm not sure what database that's referring to. The city does have what they call its IMAPS online mapping program that does have the all of the zoning layers, including the historic overlay district zoning. And as of 6 months or so ago, it also has a layer for individually designated landmarks. So anyone who's savvy enough to know to think to look up the zoning of their property would have the opportunity to find that. And actually, from that mind, we can look and see. I look and see if there's any way to add a link from that IMAPS, because right now it just says this is what it is. There might be some way to link to the HOD, the Historic Development Commission website. And then just some additional information that people have suggested as, another way that realtors can make it perhaps a little more apparent that the property that they're either, helping someone buy or sell, is in the overlay district, and what that means. And that sums it up. Is there any other guidance?
Why don't we take the next 25 minutes in small group, hit both of those two questions then. The first on the, what have you heard about the composition and structure of the commission that is important to you, and the 3 points that you want to communicate to the commission as they look at those recommendations? And second, what have you heard about the recommendations from the staff about informing new residents of historic districts?